Well, here we are. We've arrived at the final stretch of Unified English Braille for Vision Professionals. Today we are on session 10. These last three videos touch on topics that are still under development. Either the UEB code itself is in its early stages regarding these topics, or BANA needs to make decisions about their application, or both. However, I think it's important for you to know about these things as they are right now. One, so that when you're going through the rules later, you won't be surprised when you stumble onto them. Oh, gee, I never knew that. We were supposed to do that. So I want you to have some sort of understanding there. And two, so that when discussions and decisions do go public in the future, you'll have a working knowledge of what's being talked about. So let's get started with modifiers today, and then we'll move on to early English and foreign language. Modifiers are what we would call accent marks and diacritics. Diacritics are pronunciation marks, like when introducing a new word or in a glossary. So that's what modifiers cover, both of those situations. EBAE, English Braille American Edition, used a .4 to stand for all the accent marks and used different symbols for diacritics when they're talking about the long A, the short A, that sort of thing. UEB has specific symbols for each kind of accent mark or modifier, and the symbols are the same as they are in accented letters as they are for diacritics with pronunciation. So there's no difference in UEB with, say, some sort of mark that looks the same. Like I'm trying to think of a macron, but the long line above a vowel or something like that. It's not going to be different in literary context as it would be for in a pronunciation like a glossary. That's going to use the same symbols. When do we use these modifiers? We use them in literary English. That would be your basic prose, paragraphs, that sort of thing, and in pronunciations. They are not used when similar looking marks are used in math or computer programming or studying or reading a foreign language like Spanish 101, and they're not used in International Phonetic Alphabet, which deals with linguistics. Hopefully none of us will ever have to deal with linguistics. It's quite complicated. So here's a list of the modifiers. I'm not going to go through each dot configuration of each one. You just look them up as you need them. And some more. If we need more than those two first screens showed, then we have three options for us using transcriber-defined modifiers. Now these are constructed a little bit differently than the type forms or the symbol indicators were. There are just three of them, so if you need something, you need to go in order from top to bottom and use them as you go. Some examples of these things in use then. Creme brulee. The accent mark, the modifier, always goes right before the letter that's being affected. So we have CR and then a grave accent, I believe that is. That's 4-5 and then 1-6, and then our E, which carries that accent mark, and then ME to finish out the word. Same for brulee. We have the caret above the U, and then we have our acute accent above that first E. So they go right before those letters that are affected. Cafe, we have the acute accent above the E. Maître d'hôtel, we have our little hat symbol there, or a caron, I think it's called. And then we have an apostrophe. It's just a regular apostrophe. It's not an accent mark. It's just .3. And then we have our little hat sign there again for hotel. At the end, we have the capital indicator, and then our modifier with the acute accent, .45, and then 3-4, and then etienne. Now the capital indicator is always next to its letter. Nothing can come between a capital sign and its letter. However, a modifier is part of the letter. It's not a separate unit or separate entity. It's not something that's added on. It's part of what makes that letter that letter. So the capital indicator first, then the accent mark, and then the letter. Place an indicator before the modifier, because again, the modifier is part of the letter. It's not something separate. So if you have a bold word indicator, that comes first, then your capital indicator, then your accent mark, the letter, and the rest of that phrase. A la carte menu, we have our capital indicators. Again, that accent mark, that accent mark above the A is part of that letter. So the capital letters come first, and then the modifier, and then the letter. Modifiers on letters do not terminate capitalized word mode because they are part of that letter. So we have our capitalized word indicator there, 2.6s, A, O, and then our accent mark, and then U and T. A modified letter may not form part of a contraction. So if we have blessed, then we need to have the ED uncontracted. So a modifier isn't assumed that you are modifying just the next letter within a contraction like we did with type forms. If there's an accent mark on a letter with it that would have been contracted, you have to uncontract that letter combination, that group sign. So theater, we can't use the THE because the E has an accent mark above it. It has that acute accent there. So we can still use TH, but we have to spell out the E part of it, and we can't use A either. We can't use EA, not that we normally would anyway, but both of those letters have accent marks, so we need to show those individually as they are. Señor, now that for those of you who know Spanish or do Spanish Braille, you might think that dots 1, 2, 4, 5, 6 means the N with the tilde, and we'll talk about that later. But for the purposes of just regular prose, a random word thrown into what would normally be English context, it just happens to have a modifier above a letter. That does not take the place of the N. It's merely showing the accent mark, which is the tilde. So we're showing the tilde, and then we have to remember to put that N in there as well. So we have SE dots 4, 5, and then 1, 2, 4, 5, 6. Remember the N, and then OR. Once more on Braille grouping indicators. If a single modifier applies to more than one letter, enclose the modified letters in Braille grouping indicators. Grade 1 indicators are not required for the Braille grouping indicators since the modifier cannot be followed by a contraction. We just talked about that with blessed and theater. So since a modifier can't be followed by a contraction, then the Braille grouping indicator would not be misread as the contraction for AR. So we do not need a grade 1 indicator there. So we have a macron there that's above both O's. This is not two little macrons, one above each O. We have one that's covering both of them. So we need to show that. We have our macron symbol with dot 4 and then 3, 6. Then we need our Braille grouping indicators, OO, because it covers both O's, and then we close our Braille grouping indicators. Now, remember, indicators are not in print. So if you have actual parentheses around the OO as well, you need to show the print parentheses there because they are in print. So the Braille grouping indicators do not take the place of parentheses that are actually there in print. You will need to show both. Follow print for modifiers standing alone. So you just Braille what you see. Here we have the acute and grave accents that are in parentheses, so that's what we Braille. A note about the caret, tilde, and slash. If the caret, tilde, or slash are not modifiers, meaning they're not above letters, use the Braille symbols that we talked about in previous sessions. So if we're talking about a caret, that means insert this, it's not modifying the letter, we need to use that caret symbol that we learned before, not the hat symbol that we're using with modifiers. Then same thing with the tilde. If we're not talking about a tilde above an N or some other letter, we need to use the tilde symbol that we used before. And the same with the slash. If it's not a slash that affects the pronunciation of a letter, then we just use a regular slash. We're not using the modifier slash. Ligatured letters. Ligatured letters have a certain indicator. Dots 4, 5, and then 2, 3, 5. 2 cells. Various ligatures methods are used in print, including crossbars, tie bars, and letters joined together, but they all use that same Braille symbol. So we might have letters joined together, as I show with AE, either capitalized or lowercase, or OE, capitalized or lowercase. You might have a ligature tie, which looks like an arc above the 2 letters, or it might show up below the 2 letters. Or there might be a crossbar that goes through both letters. We place the ligature indicator between the 2 joined letters, not before them. Describe the print method used in a transcriber's note or on a special symbols page, because there are different ways of representing them in print, but we're only using one Braille symbol. We need to specify what we're using that Braille symbol for. So we need to say whether the letters are joined together, whether they have a ligature tie or a crossbar or some other method. The ligature indicator is considered a modifier. It does not terminate capitalized word mode, and a letter joined to another by a ligature may not form part of a contraction. So here we have Oedipus, it's all capitalized. So we have a capitalized word indicator, and then our O and E joined by that ligature indicator with the ligature indicator in the middle, which means that that is now a unit. The O, ligature indicator, and E are now a unit, which means we cannot use the ED contraction like we normally would if those letters O and E were not ligatured. And notice then we don't have to restart capitalized word mode again, because the capitalized word mode carries through any letters, and ligatured letters are considered letters. An indicator applies only to the first letter. When an indicator is required for the second letter, place the indicator before the ligature indicator. So, our first example, we have capital A and then a capital E, then TNA. So we need to show that both the A and the E are capitalized. So, and the ligature indicator then comes after the capitalized indicator. So we have capital A, capital, the ligature, again, is considered part of the unit of E, so that is placed between the capital indicator and the E. Then we have Thessalonian, we have T, which is capitalized, the H is not, so we show that with just a regular capital indicator, put the ligature indicator in between the T and H, and then carry on with the rest of the word. Notice that the macron there is above the O is before the O, and that little brev mark above the I is before the I. Then we have TH, which has a cross through ligature mark. It's also in italics. So we have our italic indicator, then our T, then our ligature indicator, H, and then carry on with the rest of the sentence. When a modifier is required for a letter joined to another by a ligature, place the modifier immediately before the letter to which it applies. When a single modifier applies to both letters, use those Braille grouping indicators that we talked about in a previous slide. So our first example, we have the A and E are joined together with a cross through. You can barely see it in print, but it's there. And then it's showing just the A has a macron above it, not the E. Or the other way around, we have A and E. There's a cross through ligature mark there, but only the E has the macron. So we Braille exactly the way it is. Macron, and then an A, and then our ligature indicator and the E. Or then we have A, ligature, the macron is above the E, so that's where we put it, right before the E, and then of course a question mark. And then there's other word from Old English, I think it is. I'm not going to try to pronounce it, but it's W or capital H W, and then that little macron is actually above both the A and E. It's short, but it's above both. So we need to show that macron, and we need to show that's going across not just the A, but the E as well. So we need our Braille grouping indicators, then our ligature, or with the A and E on either side of that ligature mark. Close your Braille grouping indicator, and then just the regular R. Do not use the ligature indicator for the A and E or the OE diphthongs unless the letters are joined as ligatures in print. So if they're just A and E and O and E and they're not joined in any way, they're just regular diphthongs and you can use contractions as you need them. But if they're joined together in any way, either they share a line like they're smashed together, or they have an arc above or below them, or a line through them, those are ligature marks. So then you would braille them as ligatures. But if they don't have those things, they're just regular diphthongs. Use the ligature indicator only when the ligature has meaning, is in pronunciation or some other situation, or not, and not when it is merely an aspect of the print font being used, like a handwriting font that happens to join the A and E together because of the way cursive writing is done, or the O and E. We also would not use it just for a logo that happens to join them for stylistic purposes to, look enticing or whatever. We're not going to use it for that. Only when they really mean, when it's part of the language that they're joined together. The Eng and Schwa, we just braille them when and where we see them. The Eng has a special symbol. It's dots 4, 5, and then N. And the Schwa has a special symbol with dots 4, 5, 6, and then 2, 6. Greek letters are kind of special. Follow print for the transcription of Greek letters. Use the Greek letters listed here in the English context or in English technical materials, but not Nemeth. Nemeth has its own way of depicting Greek letters within a mathematical context. So again, if you are a Nemeth transcriber or using Nemeth, keep your code straight. Use UEB when you should be using UEB. You use those rules. If you are in Nemeth mode, you need to be following Nemeth rules. So be careful. In UEB then, we have Greek alpha, lowercase, dots 4, 6, which looks a lot like the Nemeth ones, but in Nemeth, the rules of when to use them are different. And then capital Greek alpha uses the capital indicator, dot 6. Then our Greek modifier, which is part of the letters in UEB terms. So that comes after the capital indicator, right next to the letter it applies to. So we have dots 4, 6, and then our A. In Nemeth, the capital indicator and the Greek indicator are the other way around. Modifiers are not in the list of things that don't affect standing alone status. Therefore, modified letters that are by themselves are not standing alone. There's no way we would mistake that E, for instance, in our first example, for the contraction every. So if it's an accented E is standing by itself, it's not standing alone though. So we don't need to have grade 1 indicators there. The same thing if we were just showing a U with a macron above it and there were spaces on either side of it, it's not standing alone because that U can't be mistaken for us. It has a modifier in front of it, so that's how it's going to be read. We do not need grade 1 indicators there for that. Once more on Braille grouping indicators. Use Braille grouping indicators when the preceding Braille symbol or indicator applies to all the symbols enclosed by the Braille grouping indicators rather than just to the symbol immediately following. This includes a modifier which applies to more than one letter. You can see that in section 4.2.5, which we just talked about. So we have spoon, for example, SP. That macron goes above both O's, so we need to show that with Braille grouping indicators which do not exist in print, and then our N. By the way, I'm getting all of these examples now from the previous screen we were just looking at. From now until we get to the next topic, the examples come from all over the code book, like the computer Braille code, or not computer Braille code, computer material that was scattered all over. I pulled that together. Same thing is happening here now with the modifiers. Modifiers are shown in examples all throughout the rule book, assuming that you know how to use the modifiers and as it applies to some other concept within that section. But I left those out of this video series, and now I'm pulling them together now that we have an understanding of the modifiers. So we're going through the rule book again now, section by section, and pulling out the examples that have modifiers in them. So we're going through familiar topics now and applying modifiers in those situations. For instance, in section 3, we talked about transcriber's notes a little bit, and transcriber note indicators has an example of using the Eng and the Schwa. So I pulled that out and put this into this screen. You just braille it as you see it. Notice that you use the dot locator for mention in the transcriber's note. And then in section 5, we were talking about grade 1 mode, care of maitre d'. So we have our care of there, and MA, the I with the little hat symbol there, and then TRE, D, and then that's just a regular apostrophe. Notice that that means the D is standing alone, so we need that grade 1 indicator. In section 8, we talked about capitalization. Only a modifier or a ligature indicator can be positioned between a letter and its capital's prefix. Again, that's because the modifier or the ligature indicator are considered a part of that letter. They're not something separate, so that they're only things that can come between a capital indicator. Otherwise, that capital indicator must be hugged right up to the letter. So we have étude, we have capital, and then our acute accent mark above the E, and then TUDE. Voyage à Nice, we need the voyage, and then capital, then our grave accents above the A with our A, and then Nice. Continuing on with capitalization, the .6 prefix, the capitalized word indicator or the capitalized passage indicator is placed immediately before the first capitalized letter or modifier to that letter. Only a modifier or ligature indicator may come between the capital's indicator and the letter. So kind of repeating things again from a different angle. So we first example here, we have our square bracket, .46, and then 126. Then we have our capital indicator, our Greek modifier, .46, S, and then our closing bracket. If that voyage à Nice phrase were italicized, it's 3 symbol sequences. That means it's a passage. So we need to show that with .46 and then our passage indicator, then the capital indicator. And then we again have the capital indicator for A, and then our accent mark there, our modifier, A, and then Nice, and then remember to close your passage, your italics passage there. Étude, if it was fully capped, then we need our capitalized word indicator there, .6, the accent mark then, the modifier, then the E that it affects, and the rest of the word. The effect of a capitalized word indicator is terminated by a space, a single capital letter, or a non-alphabetic symbol, or a capital terminator, but not by a modifier or a ligature. So, in other words, capitalized word indicator carries through letters only. Anything else is going to terminate it. So when we were reading these rules before, we would come up against again and again not terminated or affected in some way by a modifier or a ligature indicator. So that's what we're talking about right now. So we have Francois, we have capital word indicator, FRAN, and then our cedilla mark there below the C. And then continue on. So we don't need to start up capitalized word mode again after that accented modified C, because it's again a unit, it's considered one letter, so that capitalized word mode then extends through the modifier. And then we have some Greek capital letters pay attention to how this is done. We have capitals, so our capital word indicator first, and then each Greek letter has the Greek modifier in front of it. We're not going to individually capitalize each of those letters, and we don't use, we can't just use the Greek indicator in front and it means all the letters are Greek. We have to individually modify each letter for as a Greek letter. A capitalized passage is terminated by the capitalist terminator immediately following the last affected symbol sequence. So that's the rule, and the application is we have our capitalized capital passage indicator there, 3.6s. Proud to be a, I think it's a Phi Beta Kappa. And so again, we have to individually modify each of those Greek letters as being Greek letters, so .46, and then F, or what looks like an F, and it's actually, you know, the Greek letter Phi or whatever. And then we have Greek modifier 46, and then B, beta, and then we have .46, kappa. Then we have to terminate our capitals passage. Still on capitalization. When in print, an accented letter is in fully capitalized word shown in lowercase. The lowercase representation may be ignored in Braille, except when a facsimile transcription is required, when the reader has to know that this is happening. Such practice should be explained in a transcriber's note. So just for the sake of keeping all the letters even as a typeface, apparently in Europe, I've never seen this here in the States, but it must happen, where we have the E in lowercase with the accent, so that's the same size as the other letters that are in full caps. So it's just assumed that that is in caps when we Braille it. So we have .66 as our capitalized word indicator, and then that capitalized word mode carries through the modifier, even though that E is technically in lowercase. The same thing with Española. The capitalized word mode carries through that lowercase n because of the accent mark there. And once again, I point out that you have the tilde and then your n. That tilde mark does not take the place of n for those of you who are used to transcribing Spanish. Some more random examples. Punctuation and type forms are in section 9. So we have our passage indicator there for italics with Hansel and Gretel. That's 3 symbol sequences, so it's a passage. And then it carries through the H, the accented A there, and the rest of that phrase. In section 10, we were talking about contractions, and there it said use the strong group sign wherever the letters it represents occur unless other rules limit its use. So we have, again, the example of blessed. This is one of the rules that would limit the use of the strong group sign, is that there's a modifier in front of the E. So we can't use the ED contraction there. We have to modify it and then spell out ED. The rule in 10.6.5 was use the lower group signs EA, BB, CC, FF, or GG when the letters it represents are both preceded and followed by a letter, a contraction, or modified letter or ligature letter unless other rules limit its use. So again, we're including modified letters and ligature letters as letters whenever we're talking about the use of or non-use of contractions. So Abe, we can use that BB contraction there because the accent mark is part of the letter. Remember we said the lower group signs needed to be between 2 letters. Well, that accented letter there, that modified letter, is a letter. So we can use the BB contraction there. Oh, that's a word I probably should have looked up how to pronounce. Réchauffé, I have no idea. R, and then we have modified E, CH, AU, FF, which we can use because, again, that E with the modifier is considered a letter, so that F is between 2 letters, and we can use the FF contraction. Another word I don't know how to pronounce, CIN. We can use the IN because we have a modified letter there, so that's a unit. We cannot use EA because that E is modified. Use the lower group sign for en and in wherever the letters it represents occur unless other rules limit its use. That other rule, once again, is that if one of those, if the e or the I or maybe even the n, I don't know, might be modified, we can't use those contractions. So ménage, we have m modified e, that means we cannot use the en contraction in that word. Senior, once again, we can't use en because that n is modified with a tilde. Remember to put your n after that tilde mark. Rhone, we can't use the one contraction because of the modified o. And that takes care of modifiers in random text where we are, just random words show up within otherwise English text. Our next topic for this video then is going to be the development of English, which I personally find absolutely fascinating. And I think it's interesting that we have rules about the development of English. I've never had to transcribe it, but I imagine that it comes up much more frequently, say, in Europe, maybe, or in England. I don't know. But anyway, there's a whole discussion about it in the UEB rulebook. So they talk about Old English, Middle English, and Early Modern English. And first of all, it's important to know what we're looking at. So Old English is English before the year 1100. It looks like a foreign language. It has all kinds of weird symbols in there. The words are totally unfamiliar. Looking at it, most of us would have no idea that that was English, or how to pronounce them, or what they would mean. It looks and feels like a foreign language, oddly enough, even though it's our linguistically speaking, it's our ancestor to our modern English. Middle English was used between around 1100 to about 1450. It still looks pretty foreign. It still has some strange symbols in there, but the words start looking a bit more familiar. You might be able to pick out a word here and there, even though the meaning of that word might have changed between then and now. It still looks like a familiar word. Then we have Early Modern English, which started where that picks up where that left off in 1450 and continued to about 1650. It's fairly understandable, although there might be some spelling variations, like substituting V's for U's and that sort of things, or the words might be used differently, but they are still familiar. It looks kind of cute, kind of quaint, like your old shop, or like a crown with crown spelled with an E at the end or something like that. So just because something has an E at the end of it does not make it Old English, is my whole point here. Recognize it as Early Modern English because you recognize the word. It just has an extra E on there that we don't use anymore. Middle English and Old English are completely foreign. So some of those weird looking symbols that are in the early forms of English are listed here. I'm not going to go through them. You can look them up as you need them. But notice that there are a lot more ligatures used with the AE and OE combination, and they also use macrons above the letters as accent marks. And here they are in capital form, just so you know what they look like in print. Then there's this thing called a long S. The long S is not addressed in UEB. I personally think it should be, but it isn't. It's a form of the letter S when it was used in the middle or the beginning of a word, and it often looks like the letter F. So if you think that, gosh, those words look strange, it almost looks like somebody has some sort of a lisp or something like that, look and see if it has that crossbar across it. Because if it doesn't, then it's the long S. It was used in late modern English until the late 1600s, until it finally faded out around 1800 or so. The suggestion at this time is to explain that this long S is there in a transcriber's note, and that's been replaced with a regular S, or you can use a transcriber-defined typeform indicator for the entire passage. It's up to you, either one, but it should be explained. So in use, it might look like this. These are the opening words of the Declaration of Independence, and it is how it was written. It was written with the long S. And you can see where things go kind of like an F in places. So I when you start seeing that, it's the long S. So use one of those two suggestions that I talked about in the previous screen to portray something like this. Follow the provisions of sections 4.2 and 4.3 for ligatured letters and the macron. So even, this is English, so we're brailing what we see. There's nothing different about it. UEB always uses the same Braille dot configurations for the same print symbols. So this is, I would guess, either I would guess it's Old English. It doesn't look like Middle English to me. So we just braille all the symbols as we see them, put the macrons as we need them. Notice that there are Braille grouping indicators in front of, or around the A and E because of the macron that covers both of them. For Old English, because it is so foreign looking, we use uncontracted Braille. So as you see, that Old English looks nothing like modern English. Just braille the accent, the modifiers as you see them. Use Braille grouping indicators if you need them, and don't use contractions. Notice ST there is not contracted. In Middle English, you can use contractions, or you may choose not to. If you do use contractions, though, have regard for spelling variations. I have no idea what they mean by spelling variations, and so since that seems very confusing to me, and I wouldn't know a spelling variation if I saw it, I personally would use the uncontracted method of transcribing Middle English, just to be on the safe side. So here we have an example of Middle English, and again, we're using some of those strange symbols, but we're starting to see a few familiar words, and especially if you know how to pronounce those strange symbols, some of this almost starts making a little bit sense auditorially. So we have, like the word to, T-O. You can see the word A, G-R-E-T, that is probably the word great. We have S-H-A-L-L, shall, be, to. So we can start to pick out a few words. That's how you know it's Middle English. So you can use either contractions or choose not to use contractions. Again, I personally would choose not to. Then I don't have to worry about spelling variations. But if you're going to use contracted Braille, here are some examples from the rule book about making considerations for those spelling variations. Again, to me, I can't make heads or tails. I wouldn't know this if I saw it. So to be on the safe side, I would use uncontracted Braille. But this is kind of interesting if you're curious. Then moving on to early modern English, we use contracted Braille for early modern English. Again, having regard for spelling variations, whatever that means. So here we can read this, we can figure this out. So this whole passage, we're using contractions. We braille what we see. As I said, sometimes a V is used where we would use U now, or the extra E or whatever. We just braille what we see. And here the transcriber has chosen to use contracted Braille so that it follows the rule of 12.4. So how do we know when something is actually foreign versus when it's anglicized and actually has become part of our everyday English language? Well, the big clue is that often foreign words will be italicized. Not always, but usually. Anglicized words are usually in regular type. So if we have words like déjà vu or facade or resume, those actually have modified letters, but they're such a regular part of our vocabulary that they're considered English now. So we would not treat them as being foreign language. But if you're in doubt about which way it is, then consider it to be foreign. BANA has published a document, it's very short, and it's called Provisional Guidance for Transcribing Foreign Language Materials in UEB, available in PDF and BRF formats. Go to this website here to download that file if you are going to transcribe anything into another language. In that document, BANA has 4 different methods for portraying the modified letters. So the first method is using those UEB accents, the modifiers that we just talked about, and going ahead and using contractions in as we can, as long as the rules allow, in anglicized words. So those would be words in usually regular type. So just because something has an accented mark on it doesn't necessarily mean that it's foreign language, like resume. Method 2 is basically the same thing as method 1. It's just that it's uncontracted. So methods 1 and 2 would use the modified marks that we just talked about. It's just that method 1 uses contractions and method 2 does not. But in both cases, we're talking about random words and phrases that show up in otherwise English context. Method 3 is used for foreign language signs for accented letters that are actually being studied, like textbooks, glossaries, or something else where English speakers are learning another language. And then there's method 4. That's using the full foreign language Braille code, like real German that they would actually use in Germany, or real Spanish that they would actually use in Spain or Mexico or one of the Latin America or South American countries. Most of us should not touch full foreign language codes unless we've actually been fully, completely trained in those codes. So for this video series then, I'm going to talk about method 1 and method 3, because method 2 is essentially the same as method 1, it's just uncontracting everything. Do not use contractions in foreign expression, including any English words that might be contained within that. UEB allows BANA to override this rule, which BANA has done, following the Braille Formats 2016 in section 1.16.3. We generally do use contractions here in the United States, and I assume Canada, in foreign expressions that occur in an English context. So this rule that's here in UEB should be ignored or replaced with this rule from BANA. Do not use grade 1 indicators for foreign material in uncontracted Braille. Use UEB contractions in word, phrases, proper names, and personal titles which are regarded as anglicized, like Monsieur or I can't think of anything else, Madame, or something that would use a contraction. I can't think of one right now, but we would use UEB contractions for that. However, do not use a contraction that would unduly distort the pronunciation or structure of a word. That's pretty subjective, but for the most part, we would use the contractions. And just so you know, there are a special rule or two regarding the Greek language, the Scandinavian languages, and Welsh when you are using contractions in those languages. Again, this is being an international code, presumably in Europe or those neighboring countries, they would use these rules more than we would here in the United States or Canada, but it's good to know that those things exist anyway. So there are 2 ways to represent accented letters in Braille within a UEB context. One is the UEB modifiers that is used in random phrases in English context. That would be method 1 that we just talked about. Or the foreign code signs used in the country where the language is spoken, meaning learning or when you're learning or reading another language. So that would be method 3 that we've been talking about. We should choose one way or the other. Don't mix them. So if you are using foreign code signs because you're learning Spanish or learning German or whatever, that's what you should use throughout the entire transcription. You wouldn't use the foreign code signs for the German part and then use a UEB modifier for when it's just discussing things in an otherwise English context. So don't flip back and forth between the two. You need to choose which one fits your situation and then stick with it throughout the entire transcription. When you are using the UEB signs in English context, so this is just a random phrase or two that's just thrown in there, then we would use these symbols for the inverted exclamation mark and the inverted question mark that you often see that you see in Spanish. I can't think of them being used in any other language. I think it's just Spanish. So we would use these. So this would be like, hola, said the man. It's just a random Spanish word thrown in there. It's not for studying Spanish. When you're studying Spanish, then you use the question mark that you should use there, which is, I believe, that's 2-6. Do not use foreign code contractions or other signs from the foreign language code, such as punctuation or indicators. When UEB signs are used, do not use code switch indicators. We'll talk about code switch indicators in a later session. Okay, so that's one situation where we're using UEB modifiers and contractions. Now we're going to talk about using the foreign code signs when we're actually learning a foreign language as English speakers, or we're reading material from another country, again, as English speakers. In that case, we do not use UEB contractions. And it is permissible to use UEB for things like punctuation and indicators as long as it does not conflict with the foreign language code that's being used. Do not use the foreign code signs and UEB signs for the same language in the same book. So again, if we're, say this is a textbook or a worksheet where we're actually learning or learning another language, or we're reading in another language as English speakers, then we would not use UEB contractions. We would use the symbols that are in that provisional guidance from BANA, not the UEB modifiers that are in the UEB rulebook. So here we have an example of the Spanish sentence and then its English translation. So excuse my very bad Spanish, but yo soy músico. So we have the point here being the bold-faced indicator there. That's 4-5, and then a word indicator, dot 2. It's okay to use that UEB indicator there with that Spanish word. That's what the previous screen was talking about. And then we use our Spanish modified letter symbol indicator, that that's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, instead of the acute accent mark that goes before the U, like we would if it was just a random word put into an English context. We're studying Spanish now, so now we're going to use the Spanish indicators as English speakers. The same with the second example. It's also in Spanish, so we're using that inverted question mark that we would use for learning Spanish. Again, if this were a phrase that was just randomly thrown into an otherwise English context, just as literature, and the rest of the surrounding text is in English, then we would use those other symbols that we showed in a previous screen. But in this case, we're studying Spanish, so we're using the foreign language inverted question mark, which is that's 2-6. And then code switching, which, as I said, I'm saving this for another session because it's quite complicated. Our last point for all of this is mixed language literature. Now, mixed language literature is not what we just showed in the 2 screens ago, where we have a definitive Spanish phrase and then showing its translation in English, and then another definitive Spanish phrase and its translation in English. That's studying Spanish. That's not mixed language. It's juxtapositioning 2 languages side by side, but it's not mixing them. This mixed language literature that UEB is talking about is when they're flipping back and forth in no particular order, no particular sequence, seemingly randomly without reason. So for a literary works, like a prose thing, and again, this might be much more common in, say, Europe, where it's more prevalent to know more than one language, or we have a lot of Hispanic people here who can flip back and forth because that's how their minds work. So we're talking about things like that. For a literary work in which languages are interspersed with no distinction, choose either UEB or the foreign language code and decide whether or not to use contractions throughout. Do not mix the codes for any particular print character or Braille indicator. So in mixed language indicator, we have two decisions to make. We need to choose whether we're going whether we're going to use UEB or foreign language code. That's one decision. And then we need to decide whether we're going to use contractions or not. And quite honestly, by choosing UEB or the foreign language code, that might make the decision for us. For instance, if we're choosing foreign language code, then we can't use contractions, no matter whether it's actually English or the foreign language. So here's a paragraph here, and you can see it's just flipping back and forth between English and Spanish with apparently no reason other than this is the way the narrator's mind is working. The example in the rulebook, then, the decision was made to uncontract. So notice that not only is the Spanish uncontracted, but the English is as well. So that's the first decision. That's the one decision you need to make, is whether you're going to contract the whole thing or uncontract. What did I just say? Contract the whole thing or uncontract the whole thing. So in this case, it was decided to uncontract the whole thing, even the English. It's unclear whether the choice was made whether to use UEB accent, the UEB modifiers, or the foreign language accents from the BANA document, because there were no modified letters in the Spanish parts of this. It just so happened that there weren't any. So we don't know whether UEB or foreign language was used, but we do see here that again, the entire thing was uncontracted. So now that your head is spinning, take a shot at session 10, the practice, with either the drill and or the homework, and I'll see you back here for session 11. Thank you.